just be able to two finger swipe it and you're good to go. So with that, thank you for coming. I appreciate it, and I'll let you take over.
Thank you. Oh, let's get a pen, Rand. I just thought of something that I didn't mark down.
Pen?
Here.
There you go.
Okay, yeah, so my name is Aaron Holt. For those of you that I think everybody except I don't know if I've ever met you before. So just a little background on me then for the people that don't know me or don't know me very well. So I am the coordinator for the Waupaca County Treatment Court Program. I also am a licensed mental health therapist, substance abuse counselor, and clinical supervisor. I do counseling on the side out of Project Whistle downtown. I am also a teacher in Fox Valley Technical College's counseling program as an adjunct teacher. I teach the psychopharmacology class, so all about the drugs and medications and what they do to the brain and the body. I also, and I have been in the counseling treatment helping field since about 2009, so like 14 years. So I'm kind of an old timer in this field. Like most people working in the counseling field only last about 5 years, and that's the average career span because of the burnout that happens in that field. So that's on the professional side. I'll tell you, I'm gonna probably talk about like some personal experiences and some personal examples when I go through some of the stuff in here. And I'm also going to probably give a little bit of self-disclosure on a couple of things. So I'll also share with you that if I make it another 32 days, I'll have 17 years in recovery myself, and I do attend 12-step meetings and stuff as well, and I currently still do that. So there's some things I will talk about, like in sponsorship and those kinds of things, when we talk about ethics and boundaries as it relates to all of this. So let's see how this goes. Thank you. So professional ethics. These are the ethical principles based on the American Counseling Association's Code of Ethics, right? So I'm going to talk to you from the idea of what a clinician's ethical code and responsibilities are when it comes to those kinds of things. And as a clinician, I'm required to get 30 hours of continuing education credits every 2 years to keep my license. In those credits, 4 of those hours have to be in boundaries and ethics. So it's an important part of what I do as well, and my licensing acknowledges that by requiring me to get ongoing education in that field and reminders and stuff. I think that from a peer support perspective, I'm going to say this. So I used to work as a primary counselor in a residential treatment center. I know from our outcome studies that when people left treatment, when they had immediate contact with sponsors, with people in recovery, with peer support, with immediate, like within the first week of leaving treatment, another counselor, their outcomes are a lot better when it came to using, not using, that kind of stuff. So I think that as a peer support person, looking at ethics and boundaries and how that relates, this is vital to the sustainability of this as a profession, and that even if there isn't a code of ethics like I have in my profession, that it makes sense that you would adopt these if you wanted to use this as a professional code of conduct to make this how can I say it? Not make it a legit, but like make it a vital, long-term, sustainable, credible profession. Because I believe that it's a huge part of what needs to happen to help people, especially as they're coming out of treatment or coming out of hospitals or looking to get additional support services. So let me kind of go through some of these. Okay, so the first principle, right, it's called non-malfeasance, which in basic terms means first, do no harm. And that is the biggest principle. We're not trying to cause harm to anybody. Anybody heard of the Hippocratic Oath? Right, so the Hippocratic Oath is the oath that all doctors take when they start becoming a physician. That is what I read was the oldest binding document in history, and it's that those doctors will uphold specific ethical standards that are related to theirs. So, you know, that's kind of like, that's the big one, right? So if I'm looking at helping somebody and I'm kind of in a gray area and I don't know what the first question is, should I ask myself is, will it cause harm to them? And if there's a possibility that the answer to that is yes, don't do it, right? Principle number 2 is autonomy. This is the idea that you run your own life, that you get to decide the reasons and the values and the morals and the standards that you have in your own life. So this particular one is where I would say recovery coaching very much differentiates itself from sponsorship, right? So the day that recovery coaching and peer support became a thing, and people in recovery talk to me about it, they're like, how's that different than being a sponsor? This is how, right? My second sponsor that I ever had, this is one of those personal recovery disclosure things. The second sponsor I ever had, part of the agreement that we made when I asked him to be my sponsor is that I agreed that he was better at running my life than I was. He was right, he was, but that is the opposite of what this autonomy principle is, right? So that's one of the big things that differentiates how peer support is different than sponsorship. Does that make sense? Because that question oftentimes comes up, and I will say that as I have actually done a little bit of peer support work for the county and the CCS program and some of that kind of stuff in the past. And this was a bit of a dilemma for me, right? In the sense that I'm also a person in recovery and like going to meetings and doing those kinds of things. So defining what I was doing as a profession versus what I'm doing as a recovery person, passing it on, carrying that message, right? Because that's an avocation. I do that for free. The benefit of that is that it strengthens my recovery. As a therapist, as a counselor, that's my vocation. That's my profession. I'm not doing that for free. And so there's a line between those things. And same thing, like if I'm sponsoring, we have an agreement that you're going to do certain things, and my job is to take you through the 12 steps. Right? Because we're sponsoring the 12-step program. If I'm your counselor or peer support person, it's not necessarily what we're going to do, because you have your autonomy to make your decision on what your recovery is going to look like. I had it. There we go. Hey, that'll help me. Thank you. But I read from back to front. I always want to know how the story's going to end. So the next principle is called beneficence. So this kind of looks a little bit like the non-maleficence, right? Which was do no harm. But this one would be more better described as always do your best. So you always want to act in what is in the client's best welfare. You want to be good, you want to be proactive, and do your best to prevent harm, right? Having integrity in the things that you do. So this is let me give you an example of one of the fun things I love talking about ethics and ethical principles, because it's not black and white, right? There's many gray areas and come across things that are like unintended consequences as you walk through them. So let me use this as an example I'll use in this particular point, right? So I had an intern one time, and the intern was meeting with a client. The client needed to get to another appointment right after that right after they were done meeting. They didn't have anything to do right at that moment, so they gave them a ride to their next appointment. Seems like a good thing to do to help out the client, right? Do you see any unintended consequences that might come from that?
Here, repeat that, sorry.
So, I had an intern, they were meeting with a client, they got done meeting with that client, they had no more appointments. Their client had an appointment right after they were done meeting and didn't have a ride to get there, so the intern gave the client a ride to that next appointment.
Once you give them the ride, they don't continuously asking and stuff looking for the resources.
Sure. Right, so you set yourself up for a boundary problem, which we have later, an expectation of that company. It seems like you're doing a good thing, right? You're just helping them out, helping them get to a ride, not be late for an appointment, making sure they get to what they need to do.
Opening that door to be friends.
Mm-hmm.
It should be professional,
Right.
professional level.
And just opening yourself up to legal problems, he said, she said situation.
Exactly. So in this case, in this instance, it was a male intern giving a male client a ride, right? But what if now they get done meeting with a female client, and the female client is in the same situation and asks, hey, you gave so and so a ride to your appointment, can you help me out too, so I don't get in trouble for being late at mine? Then what? Right?
And in the future, in the course, and you never ride along the street.
Yeah.
You can go to second student or second course, if you get 3 sets of eyes, then it's at least acceptable.
It's not a he said, she said situation.
Right. So it's one of the cool things about ethical principles, because, and that was the discussion that we had with the intern, that I had with the intern, like, what you did was not wrong. I mean, you were trying, you thought what you were doing was acting in the best welfare of the client, doing good, always doing your best, without seeing what those unintended possible consequences were that could cause harm later on down the road. And so, taking into consideration those kinds of things when you're asking for the client, like you talk about like expecting rides and reducing the opportunity for resources. So whether we're helping somebody in recovery, or whether I'm a counselor, I'm a peer support person, there's the idea of don't do for them what they can do for themselves, right? That's enabling behavior, and we're not trying to do any of that. Reading a book.
And it gets technical too, because my daughter's best friend played on a hockey team that day. And I could take her home as long as my daughter was in the car, but even though they were best friends and we could, hang out and do stuff outside of professional time, even if she's my daughter's best friend, I couldn't take her home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when we get into like boundaries, there's this concept of dual relationships, right? And what that looks like outside of the professional relationship that exists. So just as I don't think I put this in there, but that just made me think of something. So does anybody know what the #1 predictor the research says of what predicts positive outcomes in counseling and therapeutic relationships? Is the #1 from this? I think it's the theories that they use, or the office, or the money, or the curriculum. It's the therapeutic relationship that they have with the client. That is the #1 predictor of positive outcomes. And that's the therapeutic relationship, right? So that's why we're differentiating what these principles are, and boundaries of dual relationships and that kind of stuff. We went to, as the treatment court, when we were setting up the treatment court, we went out to Michigan and we visited a mentor court, and this fills into the peer support services. So they were a big county in Michigan, and they had 75 participants in their treatment court program, something like that, and so they had 2 full-time peer support people on their treatment court team, 1 male and 1 female, that worked with all the participants that went through. And as the coordinator, getting ready to be the coordinator of the program, as I sat around and watched like the staffings from the entire treatment court team, as they talked about the people in the program, the people that knew the participants the best, that had the most feedback in the staffings, was the peer support people. And it had to do with that therapeutic relationship, right, that they had built with them. Because they shared things with them, so they knew where they were, what their boundaries were, how they needed help, and what the program could do to help them overcome those things. And that was vital. Justice. Justice is kind of exactly what it sounds like, right? Being fair, treating people equitably and fairly. Every person is different, and every situation is unique. So, I wish I would have done the thing. Has anybody seen the meme about the difference between equality and justice? Wish I could
Is that
draw
with,
it.
the blocks?
Yes,
underneath,
with the
person?
boxes.
I'll get it.
Okay. So while you're looking for that, has anybody heard the expression in 12-step organizations that we don't just sponsor the pretty ones? What that means? So it has nothing to do with beauty standards or physical standards or anything like that. It's this idea that sometimes we get comfortable with just helping the ones that are doing pretty good, like they come in kind of put together, they're not struggling a whole lot, and so yeah, let's reel out to them. But the ones that are coming to meetings high or drunk or are really falling apart, we kind of we'll just wait till they're ready, kind of thing, right? So justice would be, yeah. So equity would be justice versus equality, right? So we do what we can to help them get to the same spot versus just giving them all exactly the same thing. That would be the difference in that ethical principle. So that's perfect. Thank you. What time do we have to think?
4:30 if the.
Oh, we can wait. Okay. So fidelity would be the next one. Fidelity addresses the person's responsibility to be loyal and truthful. So say what you mean, do what you say, right? And a big part of this, as a peer support person or as a professional, is who are you when you're not with the client, right? When they see you at work or hear about you at work or at home, or in the community or at the store, are you the same person that you're telling them that you are and supporting them with your own personal experience and your own personal recovery and all that kind of stuff? That's what fidelity is all about. Because a big part of what peer support is role modeling. You're showing what your experience can do, and how it helped change your life, right? So you're being that example to them. And some things in role modeling are very subtle. Like, so we had treatment court today, right? I dress in a shirt and tie and dress pants every Wednesday for treatment court. I don't have to. I don't have I'm self-employed, independently. I could wear shorts and a t-shirt if I wanted to. There's no dress code. So why do you think I dress like this when I go to court every Wednesday?
Because you're representing yourself and what you do.
Right. So I'm representing the profession. I'm representing a person in long-term recovery for the people that know that about me. I'm representing that the fact that we're in a courtroom has a level of professionalism and standard and respect, even though maybe the justice system isn't perfect. Right, James?
James's class yesterday was great on all that.
Oh, it was fabulous.
And so, you know, those are the subtle little things that make a difference. So who are we and what do we see and what do they see when they're out there? I hope that, you know, nobody's perfect, obviously, but I would hope that if you saw me in my home or in my community or something like that, that I represent the person that I am as a professional and as the person that I am in recovery. And the final principle, and the final ethical principle, is veracity. and that's truth telling. And so there's that, the Emerson quote, "The world is upheld by the veracity of good men. They make the earth wholesome. They who live them found life glad and nutritious, and life is sweet, palatable only in our belief in our society." And so, kind of like the fidelity one, right? It's not just in with our interactions with our clients, it's also in all the things that we do and the people that we interact with. Specifically, one thing that I want to address is like a peer support type person. You know, as a person in recovery and a peer support person, and the point of that role is to share your own personal experience, to give them hope and help them overcome barriers and all of that kind of stuff. You develop a lot of empathy, especially, you know, you've been there, you might know some of the things that you're struggling with. So it can be a concern that you start to connect too close to them, right? This is kind of the boundary piece of them. And so the tendency then might be to relate so much to them that you start to enable them or cover for them, like keep secrets for them. For example, if you were doing recovery for support for somebody that was in drug court or in treatment court, and you knew that they relapsed or that they missed something, like not tell or encourage them to not tell or something like that, because you get it, you know, they might end up in jail, they might have something, you know, some negative consequence to them, and so you're kind of relating on that empathetical level of what their consequence might be, rather than encouraging them to be principled, do the right thing, have that fidelity and that kind of stuff. Obvious example would be, don't falsify somebody's activity logs for them in treatment court, right? That's harming you, you're being dishonest, you're role modeling negative things, and it's harming them because it's enabling them to not engage in healthy activities, to encourage dishonesty, to role model the idea that, okay, it's okay to tell little white lies, to make omissions, that those things are okay in the recovery process. So that's what veracity is all about. So before we move on to like the boundary piece of it, any thoughts, comments, questions on just like the idea of the professional ethical principles? Confusion. Anything I said didn't make sense, because sometimes my mouth goes faster than my brain. Okie dokie. Okay, boundaries. Boundaries defined by the National Institute of Health specifically say that boundaries define the expected and accepted psychological distance between practitioners and patients. So, you know, different things can play roles in what a boundary looks like. It's not a clearly definable thing in terms of like individuals or culture can make a difference, right? Ethics can make a difference. Setting can make a difference. Boundaries in a criminal justice setting would be different than, I know counselors that work in the prison system, they're not allowed to say their last names, right? Their boundaries are different than maybe like a counselor working in a outpatient clinic, right? That would not have a problem with anything like that. So setting makes a difference on what the boundaries are. Now, as a counselor and as a supervisor, this would be my number one concern with anybody working in peer support. I have seen it, and it's not just peer support, right? My first counseling job that I got came because the counselor started sleeping with the client and got fired, right? So boundaries is extremely important in helping you and helping them. And I will say that this counselor, she was a very good counselor. You might be surprised to hear me say she. You might think that, right, the male counselors that are more predatory. And it wasn't necessarily that. So here's my my spiel for self-care. Because the reason why I believe she crossed that boundary is because she was burned out. She was not very good at self-care, and she hadn't done a lot of work on herself and started engaging in enabling and codependent behaviors with the client, and ended up crossing that line into sexual conduct and ended up losing her job and losing her license and all of those kinds of things that went along with that. So this would be my number one concern, and if I was supervising people in this field, it would be a weekly check-in, because and I don't think in most cases when I see that, it's not intentional, right? It's not manipulative, it's not predatory, it's what I talked about earlier. It's this idea that I start to identify, there's empathy, there's an emotional connection, those kinds of things that happen. It would be, I mean, obviously if I was doing it, I would take the same sponsorship rule and peer support in that men work with men and women work with women, and you just don't cross that line, right? The problems are different, the experiences are different, and the traumas are different in many cases, and so especially for a peer support centered role, I think that would be the correct way to go. So boundaries, to me is the biggest thing, and so self-care is the easiest way to protect yourself for maintaining good boundaries, right? Whether that's maintaining your own recovery, that is maintaining your own physical and mental health, that is taking breaks if you need to, that is saying no when you need to. All of those kinds of things become part of that, an important process. So any comments or questions on the idea of boundaries and your definition of boundaries on that before?
Well, I'd just say that that is our intent, and regardless of, whether, we're working on that relationship with Cora for supervision, or if that changes or whatever. Our intent is, it's too gender specific, and we talked a little bit about, what about, the new field of gender dysphoria and how we manage that. And I think as a group of consensus, all of it is a team approach to that one, we'll spend the time and money to have two people to do that.
Mhm.
So we know how to do it, because we have no other.
And then, and go ahead.
I just wondered if also you had said self-care.
Mhm.
When you're talking about that, what would you consider something to kind of check points that you make sure you're at? I'm not sure if I'm using or knowing.
Let me bring my phone in.
Just kind of so that you're at it, can see where if you're in the right place. Because I'm not sure exactly.
So ideally, that's why working in the peer profession, not doing it alone, right? Having support, supervision, all that kind of stuff. So from a professional perspective, that becomes important. I have what's called consultation. So I talk to another professional about where I'm going. I talk to that professional about the progress of the client. What are we working on? What are their struggles? Now, am I having any biases? Am I having any sort of awareness? Yep. And then part of self-care is self-awareness, knowing myself. When I worked at the residential treatment center, so we consulted with each other quite a bit when it came to that kind of stuff, and we all had different ways of where we knew. Does anyone know what compassion fatigue is? You heard that term? Anybody who doesn't know hasn't heard that term?
What was it again?
Compassion fatigue? Okay, thank you. So compassion fatigue is this idea when you're in the helping profession, you're constantly talking to people about struggles, trauma, difficulties, all of those kinds of things. And even though you're maintaining your own detachment, your own healthy boundaries and objective view, hearing that gives you secondary trauma over time, which is called compassion fatigue, which leads to burnout, right? So there are different levels of not taking care of yourself anymore. And so professional consultation helps you address that, talk about that, identify that. When I worked in the treatment center, we would have discussions because we knew each other as professionals really well and we knew where we struggled. One, we were pretty self-aware of when we were struggling, and then two, we had coworkers and peers that were not afraid to tell us the truth. When we needed to take time off, when we needed to work on something, when we were getting overly or underly involved in a client. Me personally, I can identify when I'm starting to burn out or have compassion fatigue because I get very rigid boundaries. I get very closed off. I'm like, fuck you, your problem, go deal with it, right? And versus the other primary counselor that was in the treatment center would become the other end of the spectrum. They would get overly enabling, and they would start working way harder than the client and get really frustrated with the client because the client wasn't doing any of their own work. And so we could identify and see that in each other when we would start getting that way, and so we would be like, oh, why don't you take this Friday off, go have a good time, get out of town, go on vacation, go get a massage, any of those kinds of things to do. So that's one way. Self-awareness, professional consultation, regular check-ins would be one. Self-care can be everything from meditation, maintaining your own recovery, taking a bubble bath, getting a massage, anything that de-stresses you to, vacations and any of that kind of stuff. I don't have my phone and I can't remember what the name specifically of it is. And I can let Michael know and he can maybe email it to you when I get back and I see my phone. But there are some apps out there that are specifically for professionals in the helping field. And it asks you questions on scales like, do I feel fulfilled in my job? 1 to 5, yes or no. Do I feel like I'm being helpful in my job? 1 to 5, that kind of thing. And then it tracks like when did you take your last vacation, that kind of stuff. And you can take that every couple of weeks or every month or every quarter, and it'll give you a scale. It'll actually give you a scale on where you are on that self-care and that burnout level. And so if you're getting kind of high on the burnout scale, then maybe
Like
it's
a
on that.
work balance type thing?
Yep. Yes. Does that answer your question? There was something else that came up next. I don't remember now.
It was the gender.
Oh, yes, thank you very much. Okay, so the best thing to do in those, especially like cultural things, and this is, I'm telling you as a professional that, I've worked with clients that come from cultures that I wasn't aware of. You want to be as culturally competent as possible, right? And I can't tell you how many cultural classes I have taken to get all the degrees that I have, and I've gotten sick of taking cultural classes, but you cannot ever know everything about every culture and every person and everything that exists. And so the best thing that you can do if you're not sure is say you don't know and ask the client. Right? Go back to the very first principle, do no harm. And the second principle, autonomy. They know what's best for their life, and what works best for them. And so if you're not sure, ask them. I have learned some awesome things about people that I didn't understand, about or cultures that I didn't understand, by simply saying, I don't know, tell me. And if I say or do something wrong, correct me so I know better next time, right? And I've had some awesome clients who were willing to do that for me. Yeah, and don't assume because they say that they're one thing that puts them in a box or something like that. I've worked with lots of Native American clients over the years in the treatment center that I worked at, and they all were on different levels of a continuum or spectrum on how they related to their Native American culture, from none at all to very strongly, right? So it was important for me to ask if that was important to me. So boundary issues. boundary issues are, defined as anything that strays outside of the scope of helping the client in their therapeutic goals. So this kind of fits into what Michael opened up with, the idea of like, if you're working with somebody, if they're working, they're seeing, imagine that you're working with somebody in like a CCS program, right? Everybody knows what CCS programs are. And so in that program, okay, so CCS is it's a state funded program where counties get certified. It's called Comprehensive Community Services. And so people that qualify can get help, and they can get all kinds of wraparound services. And they get a case manager. So somebody in that program might have a psychiatrist, a doctor, a therapist, a mental health counselor. They might have all of these different kinds of things. And so if this is where the art of counseling comes in, right? The art of therapy comes in. If their therapist is telling them one thing, and you're maybe not sure that that's right, careful, right? Careful how you approach that prospect, especially if you go back to that therapeutic relationship, right? The importance of that therapeutic relationship. If that is working for the client, and you don't agree with that because it's something that you have in your recovery, kind of roll with it, work through it, that kind of thing. Does that make sense the way that so anything that goes outside of that scope is considered a boundary violation. So when I first got into the field, I started out as a substance abuse counselor. I got licensed as a substance abuse counselor. So the scope of my practice at that time was only counseling people for their substance abuse disorders, right? And so if somebody came in with co-occurring mental health disorders, I can't treat that. That's working outside of the scope of my practice. I could lose my license. I could be sanctioned, fined, sued, any of that kind of stuff if I tried to treat that, right? That would be like me trying to do brain surgery on you. Literally brain surgery, because I just, feel like I read something on Google about brain surgery, and so I should be able to cut into your head now. No, I'm not trained in that. That's outside of the scope of what my practice is, and it was one of the reasons that encouraged me to continue to go on and go to school, because that doesn't make sense. I mean, it's hard for me to sit down and talk to somebody about their substance disorder that's exacerbated, or they're using it to medicate a co-occurring disorder or something that's going on. I can't do anything other than provide some education on that. So understanding the scope of what you do is an important part of the boundary that you have too, right? I'll go into another problem that I have encountered many times in my 17 years of going to 12-step meetings. Discussing mental health medications in a 12-step meeting is an outside issue. If you're familiar with the tradition and you have no opinion on outside issues, that should never be a topic in a 12-step meeting. So if you're a peer support person and you don't have a degree in psychiatry, therapy, or psychopharmacology, you should not be giving advice on mental health medications, right? You can share your experience with it, but you should not be giving advice on it. That would be outside of the scope of what you're qualified to do. Same with me. I can tell you the information because I teach a class on it and provide education and that kind of stuff, but I can't prescribe it. I can't tell you what you should or shouldn't take. I can give you the pros and cons and what potential side effects are and the way that kind of stuff. That is within the scope of my practice.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if we have, you know, we gotta be careful not to violate, the therapeutic goals for treatment for somebody like that. As a peer support person that gets paired with somebody, whether it's through drug court or CCS or whatever, are they gonna have communication with their doctor? Or like a clinician there to be able to say, this is what we're trying to do so we don't step on each other? How does that?
So it depends on the situation. If they were a person in CCS, most likely yes, because they're in a CCS program. There is a case management meeting that happens monthly or quarterly with everybody that's a part of the support staff team. So you probably would have that communication in that discussion. At the very least, even if the doctor's not attending that, there would be somebody from Health and Human Services, and you would have a case plan from the case manager in the program that was there. I would suspect that any decent therapist or counselor working with somebody that's also working with a peer support person would sign a release. They would have to legally have a release to have a discussion with anybody like that. But I would think if they knew about it, they would happily ask to have them sign that release to have that open discussion. My experience working with doctors is you're probably not going to have that discussion with doctors. I very rarely get that opportunity. Sometimes I can talk to doctors, nurses, but doctors usually think that they are the doctors and that's the final decision. Sometimes, not always the case, but I would say 3 out of 4 times that has been my experience.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
At a 12-step meeting, asking for anecdotal evidence of the naltrexone, how it's affected people in the room, would that be going too far across the boundary?
So, I'll talk to you, if you wanna ask me that question after this, I'll talk to you about it, but I feel like that's how we're talking about it. Cause that's more of a 12-step, traditional description and.
I was thinking pharmacological,
Hmm?
I was thinking within the pharmacological, if that becomes inappropriate. We can talk about it.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? So what, I guess I don't know the exact, on this, what is there a legal responsibility, or what's the responsibility when it comes to confidentiality for a person in the peer support role?
So, this is the Wild West of the recovery ecosystem, and there is not, like, anything that I can find, even emailing with WICPS, the people that do the state, who are certified in the state, with CPAR, like, there's no, every answer I get is different.
Okay.
So, I am just taking what the state gives out to healthcare providers and using that.
Okay.
And so we're doing training right off of that.
So kind of based on HIPAA regulations and that kind of stuff.
Even to the point where we pay the extra whatever for Microsoft so that we have the compliant platform
Okay.
for EMRs and stuff like that, so that we just don't even have to have the discussion. We're gonna treat it as if we're in that profession, just so that we are for sure covered.
I think it protects the client and it protects you in that way too, especially somebody new getting into it, confidentiality can be really important, especially in a town like this, right? I mean, certainly know plenty of people that started their early recovery by going to meetings outside of Wapaka because they didn't want anybody to see that. So I think that that's good, and so I would, I would suggest then, when it comes to that kind of stuff, how would you handle that with meetings and those kinds of things then?
So we had this conversation, which we're really struggling to know. talking yesterday about, so we get people trained and everybody's up and running and ready to offer peer support, and we get someone from treatment court. If you take someone from treatment court, so my personal, I won't go to the meetings, except keeper meetings, because I feel like that if someone that's in treatment court opens up about something that's going on, now I have to report that. And then I also think of what that does to them, if I'm sitting in that meeting and they really needed to share something that they don't want them to know yet. Because my answer is always, we gotta tell, we know that pretty well, and it's just, I'm going to volunteer you to tell them this. But, so knowing that, I can't, not that I can't, but I don't go to the meetings in town, so, unless there's meetings. And we don't know the answer. Like, we all talk about it, and we're like, but then are we all removed then from our community and our recovery groups and our everything as peer support specialists that disqualify us? That's not healthy either. And peer support specialists don't make 6 figures, right? So then
Neither do counselors.
I mean, I personally rely on the meetings here, I connect with the people that I've been going to the meetings with for a year now, so like just to remove myself, I feel like that would be damaging for me, maybe not, but maybe it will, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we expect them to then like pay extra gas to travel out of the city to go to a meeting? It's not, we have a perfect answer.
Yeah, and building those relationships up all over again.
Yeah.
Make a meeting,
You know how
a
scary it
closed
is?
meeting for ourselves.
That's what I was just gonna
Meeting
say.
for professionals, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, I think so that's part of what would help with the boundary issues and the self-care. Even if it wasn't like a 12-step professional support meeting, but having a group and an organization that everybody falls under the umbrella, so that, if you could have, weekly, individual meetings and then maybe monthly group meetings, so that you can kind of process those kinds of things and come up with those kinds of decisions. Because it is unique being in a town this small, and then having that role of being a peer support person. So you're, in many cases, a peer support person is a person in recovery, because it's based on that lived experience and sharing that. And like we were talking about, self-care and maintaining your own recovery is an important part of healthy boundaries and taking care of yourself and all of that kind of stuff. Interesting thing. Maybe we'll have some time, we can talk about that more in the dual relationship. I know as a professional how I handle it, and it's a little different in different situations, and it's been different for me since I started working in Wapaka and live in Wapaka versus when I worked in Stevens Point and lived in Wapaka and stuff. So I can give you some personal experiences with that. So
One last boundary question.
Go.
I was told by someone with much longer sobriety than me that if I see a former student in a meeting, I have to leave. Because the admin is broken.
What's the teacher's responsibility for that?
Especially if it's your former student, I don't understand how that is.
That's what your films.
No.
That's like me seeing someone I used with and.
Yeah.
And anytime someone walks into a meeting, you have to leave. This person was quite adamant
Um,
Garbage is right there.
I got one more boundary slide. So this is boundary issue types, right? So there's basically 2 types of violating boundary issues. One is a boundary crossing. It's a deviation from that therapeutic relationship that's harmless, non-exploitive, and maybe even possibly supportive in the therapy itself. My example with the intern giving the ride would be an excellent example of a boundary crossing, right? There was nothing exploitive there, it didn't cause any harm, they actually thought that they were doing the right thing and doing a good thing. It wasn't until we had the opportunity to go back and kind of discuss what the unintended consequences and like you guys examples of, what could possibly go wrong in harming their recovery or the, potential of other people that we work with, and he said, she said kind of thing that you start to understand that, oh, maybe that was a boundary crossing issue. another, that would be a good example of why it's important to have those meetings and those discussions, because, that would have never come up if I wouldn't have known that happened, we wouldn't have had that opportunity, it would have just been something good that they did. The other boundary thing is a boundary violation. So a boundary violation in contract is harmful, predatory, manipulative, it can cause damage to the client, it can be manipulative in nature, it can even reignite or cause new trauma for the client, right? Understand that they are vulnerable people, and we are vulnerable people with pasts and stories, especially if you're working in as a person with a lived experience, right? So when I first went to counseling school, one of the dean of the department had told me in a meeting one time, he goes, if you do this, remember that you're going to be working with addicts, people with mental health problems, codependency problems, and those are all just your coworkers. Right? Because we all bring our own stuff into the environment too, and so when we're not working on those things, when we're not doing the self-care, we become in real danger of crossing that boundary, not just in that harmless thing, but in causing more harm and doing the boundary violation. An important thing to understand when it comes to helping professions and the boundary idea is that there is a power dynamic there, right? That you are a peer and you're sharing your lived experience, but there's an understood power dynamic that exists, and it depends on the setting that you're in and how that scale can tip even further, right? So if you are a peer support person working with somebody in drug court, your power dynamic is very strong there, because you have the ability to tell on them, snitch on them, get them thrown in jail, all of that kind of stuff, right? Yeah, or prison. So there's a power, there's an unstated power dynamic that exists within that boundary thing, and so you have to understand that when you're working with them, they may agree to things or do things that are with that power dynamic. It also means that if you are not healthy, you have the ability to use that power dynamic to cause harm to somebody. Who all knows what 13th stepping is? Who knows why they suggest you shouldn't get in a relationship in your first year?
It's gonna fall apart, 'cause you're changing so much.
Talk more about that.
You're just changing, like, you're working on yourself, you're in yourself, so something that I might have liked 6 months ago and someone might not do that today. Yeah. And everyone grows on their own pace,
Exactly.
whether they're in recovery with me or not.
Yeah, and so we're working with it, we're helping people with that, and so they're still, depending on, maybe traumas that they've had in the past, they may not understand that dynamic or misinterpret some of the dynamics and some of the helping that's going on in there, and so from the role that you're playing, you have to be able to want to establish and identify those boundaries.
I was gonna say, when it comes to the therapeutic relationship, the client, the professional therapist may not actually understand what they're getting into is for their benefit. What if at some point they need more therapy and they're resistant already in therapy? The job of the peer support specialist is to connect with them and say, hey, you may not see eye to eye with your therapist, and I'm not agreeing with you or your therapist. I'm advocating for you to seek help, right? Because that's what my job is really.
Right.
Well, pretty clear cut.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is, before you got here, we talked about like all the different ethical principles, right? That autonomy piece of it, that they can, that you can advocate for them, but they have the ability to make their decisions on what's best for them in their recovery process.
and it's not placing the idea in their head, it's just saying, hey, there's multiple pathways here.
Mm-hmm.
Just because AA doesn't work for you, NA doesn't work for you, doesn't mean that, you know, mindful meditation doesn't work for you, or going to other forms of therapy doesn't work for you.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of trauma that most of us are, you know, we're not informed on how to react or respond to it.
Mm-hmm.
Any other comments on the boundary issue types and risks associated with that? So I really think that, again, as a peer support person, you know, on the one side, talking about the ethics and ethics that we talked about, the idea of maintaining credibility and the importance of that recovery role, and the idea of this being a profession, that fits with those same ethical standards that we talked about at the beginning. And I think that on the boundary side of things, that is the biggest concern for somebody working in the terms of being aware, right? Being aware of what you're there to do, how you're connecting to them, what potential harm and unintended consequences could come from the decisions that you make, being able to follow the different paths of recovery and what works for them versus what I'm doing as a sponsor or some of those kinds of things. So for the last slide then, since we do have time left, let's talk about some specific examples of different things that often come up in the ideas of ethics and boundaries and some discussion points around them. So how would you handle gifts from the client? How come?
Respectfully decline.
Okay.
I mean, if we're
Like,
looking at doing it from the same vantage point of trying to hold the same ethical standard as a clinician, that's just not okay.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just not okay. That crosses a professional line, it makes it more personal. I mean, I don't look at it in the same light as a kid bringing an apple and setting it on the teacher's desk, which doesn't bother me any further. But, you know.
Especially if it's got a worm in it.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit different because of the type of, context that the relationship's in, you know? And then, yeah, I mean, just to piggyback on what she was saying, is that the emotional maturity, some of the people, you know, we come into recovery, our emotional maturity is that, you know, it's fucking screwed up.
Mhm.
You know, like back, and then I figure they say it, you kinda get arrested when you start using. So, you know, here almost 18 months ago, I came into this with like the emotional maturity of an 8-year-old, you know, not good, not okay. So just taking that experience, strength and hope and putting it to a gift, I don't think we should take it.
Okay. Just to continue to create discussion, anybody have a different view or thought?
Favoritism, all of that. Okay. Mean so, or getting so close, like, she accepted this for me, all that. Just gets messy.
Definitely can. I'm not disagreeing, and I'm not saying that you're right or wrong. I'm gonna play devil's advocate. This is why I love ethics, because there's always opportunity for discussion and gray area. So taking your same point that we're working with people early in recovery, that may be emotionally immature, that are emotionally 13, 14, 15 years old, and now they have a long history of trauma, abandonment, and rejection, and they come and offer you a gift.
Trust, it could be a trust project.
Mhm.
What's the trade-off? I mean, it's gonna be individual, right? It's a purely subjective thing.
Right.
It's going to be our individual right to conduct ourselves according to our own experience, strength, hope, and beliefs. So for me to say, I'm not gonna take a gift, that's what I'm gonna do. Somebody else may use that as a trust holder, but there's other ways to build trust with people, that's something.
Mhm.
This is where I would bring my personal experience into play. I was here once, and this is not, you know, what worked for me was going and making connections in the community, right, and advocating. And what can I do to bring these pieces to you so you can utilize them yourself? That's where, you know, the gift that I'm giving you is hope. It's the only gift I can take from you and give back. So that's it.
So you would say you wouldn't accept the gift either?
I would respectfully have that conversation.
Okay.
And I think that's an easier fix with a group like this. We just have a policy. And then it's like, hey, it's not you, it's me, you know, because policy says.
Yep.
And then we've deflected that.
I mean,
Yeah.
you
Absolutely.
can, rules can,
Just saying,
Just
just saying,
I'm
thinking
just, well,
it.
I'm just saying, I don't know how to say it properly, because I'm saying, I think that rules provide structure, but rules shouldn't be there when we're talking about being autonomous and being out there working with people from our own experience, strength, and hope. They shouldn't dictate either, ethics or be there to prevent ethical decay. I think it's a misplaced word. You have to, like you say, you have to operate with integrity. If you can't, then this is probably not for you. You know, and integrity is different for everybody.
Something a little different, not exactly, but, I used to work as maintenance at an assisted living facility, and they said that, you know, a lot of the time when I go in there, fix their air conditioner or something like that, they wanna give you something, and if it was anything, like, they said anything over like $5 or something small, or something like, that it was just, if they gave me cash, I always took it back to the lady and just applied it to the account, that way they were feeling like they were still giving it to me, but I wasn't actually taking it. But a lot of that came out of, you know, they could be taken advantage of very easily in that place.
And that actually creates another conversation. Really, what he just alluded to creates another conversation.
Yeah, so it goes back to what I, like in the boundary thing, the power dynamic, right? So we can use that power to take advantage of people in that situation. I'm not gonna say that there is a right or wrong answer. Some places try to do they do the policy, whether it's over a certain amount, we're just not allowed to take it, that gives you an out. I just can't do this, I really appreciate it, I thank you, but I'm not allowed to take anything like that for our company policy. And then, and some people have, because they don't wanna give that person that sense of rejection or something like that. Those of you that have seen my office, and I have my little corner with all my Star Wars little things in the corner of it.
Force is strong with you there.
Always. So every single thing in that corner is a gift from a sponsee or a client, but except for the do or do not Yoda thing.
Okay.
Huh?
Is that from Ken?
No, I bought that one myself. Because I'll try, do or do not.
The
Yoda
other
was a
thing
great sponsor.
to add to that was, you know, rules and structure, but the culture of the organization, if we're out there representing, you know, Impact has a culture in place, the ethics get fed by that culture, mission, vision, values, culture, and that should inform the ethics of the people that are out there.
And also, this whole dynamic could be shifted if we have that conversation, the immediate initial contact that we have with you. I mean, this doesn't even have to become an issue of what they're perceiving to be. This is what it is, just like confidentiality in the first, as a professional, right?
Here's the
I
rules,
mean-
guidelines, sign your life away.
Yeah, you just lead with core values, right? So you just have that all, we have to, work to get that as a culture, where it's not like, the words tell us what our culture is, not the other way around.
Right.
And so we know how we're gonna lead, and then again, with the core values over, you know, it's like, these are some boundaries. And it doesn't have to be dogmatic or rich, you know, like religious about it, but it's like, this is the ethos that we operate in. And you know, it's not like we're charging people, you know, we're seeking to get contracts with CCS and hope to help people get before and that sort of thing. But overall, like our whole point is to go out and provide this at no cost to the individual, so that anybody can have those services. And I think that just that, even that leading edge of that ethos is like, yeah, we're not, taking a gift would be counter to our core value of giving, you know, it just doesn't line up.
And I think, you know, back to James's point and some of the other points that people made, like if you're a peer support person, especially a peer support person who's in recovery sharing your lived experience, I mean, isn't part of recovery integrity, like doing the right thing when nobody's looking? And so if you're role modeling that to somebody that you're helping, you wanna represent that as well. And so that power dynamic, that's where you become responsible as a professional, having that integrity. I'm gonna do the right thing when nobody's looking, even if they're offering me this, if that's what the rule is, or I don't feel it's right, or it's poorly motivated, or I'm doing it, I'm willing to accept it because of selfish wants that I need, then my integrity and my own recovery, my own values, my own morality says, no, I'm not gonna do that. I appreciate it, but I'm not willing to accept it. For me. Not because I don't appreciate it, not because I'm rejecting it, just don't feel it's good. Dual relationships. So this is a big piece of clinical boundary issues, and this is we'll go back to that, like meetings, right? When you're doing self-support things. So dual relationships happen in lots of different situations. As a professional and as a counseling professional in a small community, when I worked at the treatment center, if there were people that were from Wapaka and they were leaving treatment and get ready to go out, I'd be like, just know that I can't acknowledge you, right, for confidentiality reasons. So I'm not being a dick, I'm not being an asshole. If you see me and I don't say anything, it's because that's my responsibility. I can't break your confidentiality. You can acknowledge me, and then if somebody says, well, where do you know Aaron from, then it's your responsibility to tell them, but I can't. So, if you're working at Quick Trip and you're a patient of mine and I walk in, I'm just gonna act like I have no clue who you are, because that's what my responsibility is. But the thing that gets really tricky, especially in a small town, is that, like, I've had clients that have come to my house to do work because they work for the company. I had an experience with, and I had to get clinical supervision because I had no idea how to handle this. So I had a client that I had a couple of times at the treatment center. Their spouse worked with my wife at her place of work. We were having some car troubles, and apparently she was talking about it at work, and all of a sudden she comes home and says, hey, this person that I work with, their spouse is really good at working on cars and just offered to come and help work on the car. And I'm like, oh shit, because it's my previous client at the treatment center. So I can't tell my wife because that's breaking confidentiality. Dual relationship, right? That's outside of the scope of the therapeutic relationship. They're going to come work on my car. All right, there's a power dynamic there. There's an expectation there. This plays into all kinds of strange, weird, ethical gray areas and stuff. So I had to go tell my supervisor, this is what happened. I don't know how to address this or deal with this. And so he gave me some feedback and we figured out what to do. But the important thing was that I didn't hide it, and I got supervision on it and talked about it, and we came up with a plan that we thought was appropriate and ethical for it. You were gonna say something, Zach?
Yeah, I was gonna just touch on it. You said the word transparency,
Mhm.
just being upfront about it. And I'm thinking to myself, maybe like going to McDonald's. Right? You go to McDonald's, somebody hands you, wants to take your cash. It's not nearly as intimate as somebody put your under bar, but they're still providing you a service.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and so that's, that is certainly a thing with a small town, because you're going to bump into people that are clients. So how do you address that from a confidentiality perspective, from an ethical perspective, from a power dynamic perspective, and then let's go back to the meeting perspective. Talk to me more about that. Like, what do you feel is right for you and your recovery and for them?
So for me, if I want to go into peer support, for me, I will go to other areas for the meetings. That's just me. If I want to be able to go to these meetings, then I won't be a peer support. That's just me.
Okay.
I guess for me, if I see my peer support person walk in, I'll probably leave. No questions asked. But other peer support people or people that are being supported, the peers themselves, if they're not particularly my peer, then I should be, be able to stay.
I would say as long as I'm there for the meeting and not here.
But if you have something that's not that they're about to relapse, or they did relapse, and now you've got an obligation to report,
If that's your peer.
if that's your peer.
To their probation or whatever.
It's a mandatory report.
And I think that depends on how, so this is where it gets money, it's like who are we servicing them as a treatment court provider, as a CCS provider, or as a nonprofit provider, or as, so like, if, somebody in here that isn't in treatment court tells me they relapse, like, I have no obligation to say anything to anybody about that.
But if I say something to you,
Then
you
you
have
put
to
me
go
in a
back to
bad
drug
spot,
court.
and I'm gonna be frustrated with you.
Right.
It's like, don't do that, but also do that, so it's like, you know, it's really hard. And I've just chosen, because I know that that power dynamic exists, is to just not go to meetings here unless it's a speaker meeting or a one-off. And that stinks for me, because like, this is the first time in history we're active recovery is doing things and changing things, and so it's like, man, you know, like, I didn't miss out on that, because it was, when I had first gotten into recovery, this is, you know, it's a little different here. Like, we would have been like youth leaders.
Yeah.
In meetings, so, yeah.
I mean, otherwise, we can talk about a closed meeting.
And I kinda like what Justine's saying, just having a closed meeting between us, you know, so we still get that support that we need.
Right. I'm sorry, but I don't have a vehicle to travel to another place, and I don't have expenses to do that. Where, you know what I mean?
So
Where I live, there are no meetings.
I will promise you, this will be a situation that will come up that you probably need to talk or address, especially if you start doing peer support through CCS services. Like, you'll have somebody that part of their case management plan is to attend a 12-step meeting, because they've never been to one, and they're afraid to go to one by themselves. So as a peer support person, you're going to take your lived experience and take them to a 12-step meeting. You're getting paid to do what you do unpaid. And so how you balance that, again, from that ethical boundary perspective and your own recovery for what you're doing as your profession, because that will come up. And that will be something that you'll have to address.
Question. But if someone is going to a 12-step meeting and they're going to talk about themselves, haven't they given up privilege at that point, because there's more than just one person?
No, because it's part of the meetings is anonymity.
And spiritual foundation.
Yeah.
Because you don't have to disclose that, you can just sit there and be quiet.
You can, but you gotta think about what your presence in that meeting does to the outcome.
Yeah.
That's the
If
biggest.
they know you're a peer support person, they might not wanna open up, whatever they may have things that need to say, they may not say it if we doesn't in recovery.
My 2 cents on this is having that conversation with them through like, what it is.
Yeah, but then it's your obligation, if you're in a meeting with that peer, that is your peer, your obligation, if they say something that they have done, or thinking about doing, or they are going to do, you have to report that. Whether it's CCS or whatever, their caseworker, probation, whoever it may be, you are obligated to report. Yeah, you are obligated to report that, so that's why you're worried about like going to a meeting and your peers, or even just another peer that they know you're a peer support.
Like, how do we still get our support?
I think there's enough people in this room to have them.
Yeah,
I mean, really.
I agree, that's the solution.
I think the group, yeah, peer support group meeting would be great. The other thing is basically our job is resource brokers. If we can't find somebody in the program to point them to as a sponsor or a ride to get them to a meeting or something like that, then we're not doing our fucking job either.
Right.
You know, I mean, that's part of it. There has to be a fundamental line between, not just what we're talking about here, between sponsorship and peer support, but, you know, from the program end of it, sponsorship to peer support. You know, the sponsors, like you said, the sponsor's not getting paid. If we get paid to take somebody to a meeting, that's an ethical problem from the other end, from both ends actually, but, I mean, that's the thing, it's a matter of getting as the community, the recovery community gets more and more robust, we'll have more people that are qualified and willing to be sponsors out there, and we'll be able to, as resource brokers, point people towards those people and get them into the meetings. that's one end of it. The end as far as us going is, I mean, the easiest solution, easiest two solutions I see is one, we have a peer support.
Closed
We,
meeting.
DAA meeting closed to just people who are in peer support. And then the other option there, if you don't like that, is that you gotta drive, you know, and it sucks, but that's
You
part of
know,
the
the option of
responsibility.
get up and leave
That's
if
right.
your walks in.
And, well, the other option there is that if your recovery's at a point, or let's just say where if your health is at a point where you feel like you need to go to more meetings, you don't have transportation to
Then you
get there,
probably
you
shouldn't
probably
be a
need a
peer
peer
support.
support specialist yourself,
Right.
but you shouldn't be doing it for it.
Right.
And the only
Right.
reason why I wouldn't go to the meetings and walk out if a peer came in or whatever, they're gonna be looking for my car. Trust me, they're gonna look for my car before they're gonna walk in, at least I would.
Yeah, I mean, I would be willing to help facilitate getting, you know, like a DAA meeting for professionals together. I just would want, I don't know, like somebody like Aaron or with that capacity that would come in at least, you know, once a month to make sure we're not being sick, right? Cause you can form that quick and call and whatever, and all of a sudden we got a group of sick people. If we don't have someone that can come in every once in a while, then we'll
It's
see that.
supporting people that are,
Yeah.
true.
That's my only thought on it, but I'd be happy to facilitate that. I'm sure Aaron would let us use the space over there if we need to put a meeting together once a week or something.
I've addressed that myself and just about every single way that you've described, depending on the situation. I've been in situations where I've been seeing clients in an outpatient basis on a regular basis, and they were attending several of the meetings that I was attending, and so I started going to meetings outside of town. Two reasons I did that. One was to protect their recovery and give them that space, and two was because I was there for myself and my own recovery, and I didn't want to have to worry about talking about myself or my past or my own recovery in a way that could be harmful or do something to ruin that relationship. So I've done it that way. I've been unexpectedly seeing clients or past clients walk into a meeting when I've been in there, and I'll try and grab them before the meeting and just ask them if they're okay with me being there, and you know, tell them like I got a little bit of time under my belt, so I'm okay with walking away from a meeting if you're uncomfortable, and just be totally honest with me. I'm okay. I won't take it personally. If you want me to leave, that's fine. I have taken, and working in the peer support role, I have taken a client to meeting and gotten paid to do it. I was very uncomfortable doing that, and when I did it, I didn't take them to any of my regular meetings. I took them to a meeting outside of what my normal meeting was, not to hide the fact, but to tell them kind of what you were talking about. Like, I'm being a resource broker now. I'm taking you to a meeting to support you, to get you to see what it's like, and we'll talk about it afterwards. If it looks like something you're comfortable with, I'll get you some numbers, some people that I know, and then you can do the 12-step thing. That's not what I'm here for. I'm not your sponsor. I'm not gonna like be your ride person to meetings or any of that kind of stuff, but I'll get you in the door one or two times.
Is there any useful value in comparing the closed and open meeting? Because I could be in a closed meeting because I'm in recovery, and someone else could be in that closed meeting as well. I just don't see how that makes a difference between closed and open. It seems I couldn't bring a friend with me and have them involved.
At a closed meeting?
Yeah, closed meeting is if you are actively in recovery. Open meetings, anyone can go to.
A closed meeting can be whatever criteria closes that meeting. It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be that it's somebody that's in recovery. A closed meeting could mean this is a closed meeting reserved for professionals in mental health or addiction, treatment, clinical,
Because we have money in the room.
And that's it.
Just support the meeting, and we have
Sure.
money involved, so.
So the normies can't go to the closed meeting.
They can if they fit our criteria.
Or if they, or if they.
So a closed meeting just establishes a certain criteria for closing that meeting, and that can be written however you want it to be. It's not, there is no blanket closed meeting.
How about touch?
I have one more question.
Handshake.
I went to a meeting once and I was no longer teaching, but there was a student from high school who went to the meeting. Now, where was that reviewed?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part.
There was a student from the high school here in town who was going to an meeting. I was no longer a teacher, but what if there was a teacher there? And it's supposed to be a mandatory reporter, maybe that's going on in this meeting.
Well, I mean, as a mandatory reporter, you're only required to report, elderly abuse or child abuse. So, unless that's what's being discussed in the meeting by that person, you're not required to report that. As a mandatory reporter. Is our peer supports mandatory reporters?
Yes.
Okay. So as a mandatory reporter, you're required to report somebody who is actively suicidal, right, with a plan and an intent and the means to do it. A person who's actively homicidal, who's intending to hurt somebody else, or as somebody that is knows or is engaging in elderly abuse or child abuse. Those are the things that mandatory reporters are required to report.
If the person is on the receiving end of physical abuse, you're required to report that as a mandatory reporter.
Yep.
I think that only applies to children and elderly, though, right?
Correct.
So,
Yep.
so it wouldn't apply like if,
Domestic abuse by
up or something.
Well, this was a 17-year-old high school student who was attending a meeting. If I was still teaching in that building, I would feel very uncomfortable reading it.
Yeah. That would be a challenge.
So anyway, touch, I would say a handshake and introduction handshake, I think is okay if it's established everywhere. I think personally, I think we hug too fucking much.
Absolutely.
Way too much.
Yeah.
Way too many sweaty fuckers.
People have trauma.
It's like, yeah.
So that's the biggest thing to understand when it comes to touch, right? The impact of trauma. That's about being trauma informed and trauma informed care, and that idea that what I feel comfortable with could be a boundary crossing violation or misunderstood or misrepresented by somebody else based on what their previous experiences with touch could be. A general rule that is pretty easy one to abide by with simple things like handshakes and hugs and those kinds of things is let the client initiate it. Like, I hate hugs. I'm not a hugger. It's one of the reasons why I've kind of gravitated to one of the 12-step organizations more than one of the other ones. But every once in a while I'll have a client ask me, can I give you a hug? And I don't tell them no if they do that. And I even like handshakes. I will usually shake the hand of a brand new client the first time I meet them. But then I don't usually do that again unless I initiate it. Anything outside of that, probably boundary violation crossing. Confidentiality, we touched on that. Let me go back to the dual relationship thing. So the American Counseling Association standard, the basic standard of ethics, is you cannot engage in what's considered a dual relationship. So that would be any sort of like business partner, anything outside of that therapeutic alliance. So that would include being their sponsor or something like that for 2 years after they become an active client. That is the ACA standard for professional clinicians in that. In sexual relationships, I would say never, but the actual standard is 5 years.
Let's do number.
Yeah. So that's 5 years after they stop becoming engaged in professional services. I mean, I can see in a small town, they see you as a counselor. 5 years down the road, you bump into them at a restaurant, and they come up and start talking to you. Probably not the best way to go about doing it. But there are actual standards for that, and even in the dual relationship thing, it is 2 years. And I've had that situation. Like, I've had class clients that were a year out of treatment and have seen me in a meeting and asked me to be their sponsor, and I can't do it. It's a violation of my ethical standards. I actually did get all the way to 4:30.
You did, that's
So,
good.
it was a good discussion.
You guys just clap for Aaron and say that. So I think we'll take a